Emma had been walking for 3 hours through the thick snow when she heard the whimpering. The sound was so faint that she almost missed it over the howling wind. Her boots crunched through the white powder as she stopped to listen more carefully. There it was again, a soft crying that seemed to come from somewhere nearby. The 17-year-old girl pulled her thin jacket tighter around her body. She had been living on the streets for 2 months now, ever since her foster family decided they could no longer afford to keep her. The shelter in the city had been overcrowded, and Emma chose to leave rather than wait for another placement that might never come. She thought she could make it to her aunt's house in the next town, but the sudden snowstorm had caught her completely unprepared. Following the sound, Emma pushed through a cluster of pine trees. Behind a fallen log, she found the source of the crying. A medium-sized dog lay curled in a tight ball, its golden fur matted with ice and snow. The animal's ribs showed clearly through its coat, and its dark eyes looked up at her with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Emma knelt down slowly, not wanting to frighten the creature. She could see that the dog was shivering uncontrollably, and its paws were cut and bleeding from walking on the frozen ground. Someone had clearly abandoned this poor animal, leaving it to face the brutal winter alone, just like her. "Hey there, boy," she whispered softly, extending her hand for the dog to smell. "You're in pretty bad shape, aren't you?" The dog whined again but didn't try to move away. Emma could tell it was too weak to run even if it wanted to. She looked around at the snow-covered forest surrounding them. The temperature was dropping fast as evening approached, and she knew that neither of them would survive the night alone in these conditions. Emma had learned to be practical during her time on the streets. She only had a small backpack with a few crackers, a water bottle that was already starting to freeze, and a thin blanket. It wasn't much, but she knew she had to make a choice. She could continue walking and try to reach shelter before dark, or she could stay and help this dying animal. Looking into the dog's pleading eyes, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a connection with another living being who understood suffering. The dog reminded her of herself, abandoned and fighting to survive in a world that seemed to have no place for either of them. "Okay, boy," she said, making her decision. "We're going to stick together. 2 is better than 1, right?" Emma carefully scooped the dog into her arms. He was heavier than she expected, but she managed to lift him. The animal was so cold that she could feel the chill through her jacket. She needed to find shelter quickly, or they would both freeze to death before morning. Through the trees, Emma spotted what looked like an old hunting cabin. It was small and appeared to be abandoned, but it would provide protection from the wind and snow. She struggled through the deep drifts, carrying the dog and trying not to fall. Her legs burned with effort, and her lungs ached from breathing the freezing air. When she finally reached the cabin, Emma was relieved to find that the door was unlocked. The inside was dark and dusty, but it was dry and blocked the wind. She gently placed the dog on the wooden floor and looked around. There was an old fireplace, some basic furniture covered in sheets, and best of all, a small pile of chopped wood stacked in the corner. The dog tried to lift his head to look around, but was too weak. Emma could see that his breathing was shallow and his body temperature was dangerously low. She knew she had to act fast to warm them both up, or the dog might not make it through the night. Emma had never started a fire before, but she had watched other homeless people do it during her time on the streets. She gathered some old newspapers and dry wood pieces, then searched through the cabin drawers until she found a box of matches. Her hands shook from the cold as she struck the first match, but it went out immediately. After several attempts, she finally managed to get a small flame going. The fire slowly grew larger, filling the cabin with warm light and blessed heat. Emma pulled the dog closer to the fireplace and wrapped her thin blanket around both of them. For the first time in hours, she felt hope that they might actually survive this ordeal. As the cabin warmed up, the dog's shivering began to slow down. Emma shared her last few crackers with him, breaking them into small pieces so he could eat them easily. The animal ate gratefully, his tail giving a weak wag of appreciation. "I'm going to call you Max," Emma told him as she gently petted his matted fur. "We're going to take care of each other now." Outside the cabin, the wind continued to howl and the snow kept falling. Emma knew that their real challenge was just beginning. They had survived the first night, but they were still lost in the wilderness with very little food and no way to call for help. However, for the first time in months, Emma didn't feel completely alone in her fight for survival. Emma woke up to Max licking her face gently. The fire had died down to glowing embers and the cabin felt much colder than it had the night before. She could hear the wind still whistling outside, which meant the storm hadn't passed yet. When she looked out the small window, all she could see was white snow falling heavily from the gray sky. Max looked much better than he had the previous evening. His eyes were brighter and he could stand up without wobbling. The warmth and food had helped him recover some of his strength. He walked over to the door and whined softly, letting Emma know he needed to go outside. "Okay, boy, but we stay close to the cabin," Emma told him as she opened the door. The cold air hit them like a wall of ice. The snow had continued falling all night and was now almost 3 feet deep around the cabin. Emma's heart sank as she realized they were completely snowed in. Even if she wanted to continue walking to find help, it would be impossible to travel in these conditions. Max did his business quickly and hurried back inside, shaking the snow off his fur. Emma followed him and immediately began rebuilding the fire. She was grateful that there was still wood left, but she counted the pieces and realized they only had enough for maybe 2 more days if they were careful. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her that she had shared her last food with Max the night before. They were both hungry now, and Emma knew she needed to find a way to get more food and water. She began searching through the cabin more thoroughly, hoping the previous owner had left something useful behind. In the kitchen area, Emma found some old canned goods in a dusty cabinet. Most of the cans were rusted and looked unsafe to eat, but she discovered 2 cans of beans that still seemed okay. There was also an old can opener and some plastic containers she could use to collect snow for drinking water. Emma opened 1 can of beans and split the contents with Max. It wasn't much food for either of them, but it would have to do for now. As they ate, she tried to think of a plan for survival. The storm showed no signs of stopping, and she had no idea how long they might be trapped in this cabin. After breakfast, Emma decided to explore the cabin more carefully. She found some old blankets in a closet that would help keep them warmer. In a small storage room, she discovered something that made her heart race with excitement: an old battery-powered radio. Her hands trembling with hope, Emma turned on the radio and slowly tuned through the static. Finally, she heard a faint voice coming through the crackling sound. It was a weather report from a nearby town. The announcer was warning people to stay indoors because of the dangerous blizzard conditions. He said the storm was expected to last for at least 3 more days. Emma's excitement turned to worry as she realized how serious their situation was. 3 more days meant they needed to stretch their remaining food and wood much longer than she had hoped. She also heard something else on the radio that made her stomach drop. Search and rescue teams were looking for a missing teenage girl who had disappeared from the city shelter. They were looking for her, but how would anyone ever find them in this remote cabin during a blizzard? Emma felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. She couldn't give up now, especially when Max was depending on her. Max seemed to sense her worry and came over to nuzzle against her leg. Emma petted him gently and felt a little better. At least she wasn't facing this alone anymore. Having the dog with her gave her strength and purpose. She had to survive not just for herself, but for him too. Emma spent the rest of the day making the cabin as warm and comfortable as possible. She hung the extra blankets over the windows to block the cold air from coming in. She also moved their sleeping area closer to the fireplace and created a cozy spot where she and Max could stay warm together. As evening approached, Emma carefully rationed their wood to keep the fire burning through the night. She also melted snow in a pot to make sure they had enough drinking water. Max stayed close to her side as if he understood that they needed to work together to survive. That night, as they lay together by the fire, Emma listened to the storm raging outside. The wind sounded even stronger than before, and she could hear tree branches breaking under the weight of the snow. She was scared, but having Max's warm body next to hers made her feel less alone. "Tomorrow we'll figure out how to signal for help," she whispered to Max as she stroked his fur. "And we'll find more food somehow. We're going to make it through this, boy. I promise." Max's tail thumped against the floor softly as if he believed her words. Emma closed her eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that the next day would bring new challenges in their fight for survival. But for now they were warm, they were together, and they were still alive. That had to be enough to keep going. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault on the small cabin. But inside, a girl and her dog held on to hope and each other. determined to see another sunrise. On the third morning, Emma woke up to an eerie silence. The howling wind that had been their constant companion for 2 days had finally stopped. She carefully looked out the window and saw something that filled her with both hope and fear. The snow had stopped falling, but it was now so deep that it reached almost to the cabin's windows. Max was already awake, sitting by the door with his ears perked up. He could sense that something had changed outside. Emma opened the door slowly and was amazed by what she saw. The world had been transformed into a glittering white landscape that was both beautiful and terrifying. Trees were buried up to their middle branches, and the path she had followed to reach the cabin was completely invisible. The silence was broken by a distant sound that made Emma's heart pound with excitement. It was the unmistakable noise of a helicopter flying somewhere in the area. She rushed back inside and grabbed the old radio, turning it up as loud as it would go. The announcer was talking about search and rescue operations that had resumed now that the storm had passed. Emma knew this might be her only chance to signal for help. She looked around the cabin frantically, trying to think of ways to make herself visible from the air. She remembered seeing some old red fabric in one of the closets. Working quickly, she tied pieces of the bright cloth to a long stick she found outside. The helicopter sound was getting fainter, which meant it was moving away from their area. Emma climbed onto the cabin's roof, despite the dangerous snow conditions, and began waving the makeshift flag as high as she could. Max barked loudly from below, as if he understood they needed to make as much noise as possible. But the helicopter disappeared over the mountains, and Emma realized they hadn't been seen. She climbed down from the roof feeling defeated, but she didn't give up completely. She decided to keep the flag ready and continue listening to the radio for news about search operations. Their food situation was becoming desperate. Emma opened their last can of beans and gave most of it to Max, keeping only a few spoonfuls for herself. She was getting weaker from hunger, and she could see that Max was still too thin despite the food they had shared. They needed to find more to eat soon, or they wouldn't have the strength to survive much longer. Emma remembered something she had learned from watching survival shows on television. In winter, animals sometimes stored food that humans could find and use. She decided to search the area around the cabin for any signs of food caches or edible plants buried under the snow. Putting on every piece of clothing she had, Emma ventured outside with Max following closely behind her. The snow was so deep that she sank up to her waist with each step, making walking extremely difficult. Max was better at moving through the snow because of his 4 legs, and he seemed to understand what they were looking for. After searching for over an hour, Emma was ready to give up when Max started barking excitedly near a large pine tree. He was digging frantically in the snow, his tail wagging with enthusiasm. Emma hurried over to help him and couldn't believe what they found: a small cache of nuts and dried berries that squirrels had stored for the winter. It wasn't much food, but it was something. Emma gathered everything they could find and put it in her pockets. As they were preparing to head back to the cabin, Max suddenly stopped and growled low in his throat. Emma looked up to see what had caught his attention and felt her blood run cold. Standing about 50 yards away was a large black bear. The animal was thin from winter hibernation and was probably looking for food just like they were. Emma had heard that bears could be dangerous when they were hungry, especially if they felt threatened or cornered. Emma grabbed Max's collar to keep him from barking or running toward the bear. She knew they needed to back away slowly and avoid making any sudden movements. The bear hadn't noticed them yet. It was focused on sniffing around some fallen logs, probably searching for insects or small animals. Moving as quietly as possible, Emma and Max began backing toward the cabin. Each step felt like it took forever, and Emma was terrified that they would make a noise that would attract the bear's attention. Max seemed to understand the danger and stayed perfectly still beside her. They were almost back to the cabin when Emma's foot slipped on a hidden patch of ice under the snow. She fell backward with a loud crash, and Max let out a surprised yelp. The bear's head snapped up immediately, and its dark eyes locked onto them across the snowy clearing. For a moment that felt like an eternity, the girl, the dog, and the bear just stared at each other. Emma's heart was beating so fast she thought it might burst. She could see the bear's powerful muscles tensing as it decided what to do. Max positioned himself between Emma and the bear, his fur standing up along his back. Then, to Emma's amazement, the bear simply turned and walked away in the opposite direction. It seemed the animal was more interested in finding easy food than in confronting a human and a dog. Emma waited until the bear was completely out of sight before she dared to move again. Back inside the cabin, Emma's hands shook as she tried to restart the fire. The encounter with the bear had reminded her just how dangerous their situation really was. They weren't just fighting against cold and hunger. They were surviving in a wilderness full of wild animals that could be threats. That evening, as they shared the nuts and berries they had found, Emma listened to the radio again. The search teams were still looking for her, but they were focusing their efforts on areas closer to the city. She realized that unless she could somehow signal for help, no one would ever think to look for her in this remote location. As night fell, Emma made a decision that would change everything. She was going to try to hike out of the wilderness and find help, even if it meant leaving the safety of the cabin. It was a dangerous plan, but staying put was becoming just as risky. They were running out of food, wood, and time. The 5th day began with Emma barely able to stand up. Her body had reached its limit after days of cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Every step felt like she was walking through thick mud, and her vision kept going in and out of focus. Max stayed pressed against her side, using his body to help support her weight as they continued following the deer trail down the mountain. Emma knew she was in serious trouble. She had read about hypothermia and starvation, and she recognized the warning signs in herself. Her hands were so numb she could barely feel them, and her thinking was becoming slow and confused. Several times she caught herself walking in the wrong direction before Max gently guided her back to the trail. Around noon, Emma collapsed in the snow and couldn't get back up. Her legs simply refused to work anymore, and her vision was becoming dark around the edges. Max whined frantically and licked her face, trying to keep her conscious and alert. Emma wanted to tell him to save himself, to leave her and find his own way to safety, but she couldn't make her voice work properly. Max made a decision that probably saved both their lives. Instead of staying with Emma, he ran ahead down the trail, barking as loudly as he could. Emma could hear him in the distance, making more noise than she had ever heard him make before. She realized he was trying to attract attention from anyone who might be in the area. 20 minutes later, Emma heard the most beautiful sound she could imagine: human voices calling back to Max's barking. Through her fading consciousness, she heard men shouting to each other and the sound of snowshoes crunching through the snow toward them. "Over here! I found them!" a man's voice called out. Emma tried to lift her head to see who was coming, but she was too weak to move. She felt strong hands lifting her up and wrapping her in warm blankets. Through her blurred vision, she could see 3 men in winter rescue gear surrounding her. One of them was already examining Max, who was wagging his tail weakly but proudly. "My name is Jim, and I'm with the mountain rescue team," one of the men told her gently. "You're going to be okay now. We've been looking for you for days." Emma tried to speak, but only a whisper came out. "Max." "Save Max too. Don't worry, sweetheart. We're taking care of both of you," Jim assured her. "This brave dog of yours led us right to you. He's a hero." The rescue team worked quickly and efficiently. They wrapped Emma in emergency warming blankets and gave her small sips of warm liquid from a thermos. They also checked Max thoroughly and gave him food and water. One of the rescuers radioed for a helicopter to pick them up from the nearest clearing. As Emma was being prepared for transport, she learned how Max had saved them. The rescue team had been searching the area when they heard his desperate barking. They had followed the sound and found Max jumping up and down in the snow, clearly trying to lead them somewhere. When they followed him, he led them straight to where Emma had collapsed. "That dog never stopped barking until we found you," Jim told her. He knew exactly what he was doing. "I've been doing mountain rescue for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like it." The helicopter ride to the hospital was a blur for Emma. She drifted in and out of consciousness, but she made sure to keep one hand on Max, who was lying beside her on the stretcher. The medical team was working to raise her body temperature and get fluids into her system, but they assured her that she was going to recover fully. At the hospital, Emma learned just how close she had come to dying. The doctors said she had severe hypothermia and dehydration, and if the rescue team had found her even a few hours later, it might have been too late. Max was also treated for exhaustion and minor frostbite on his paws, but he was in remarkably good condition considering their ordeal. The story of Emma and Max's survival quickly spread through the hospital and then to the local news media. People were amazed by the bond between the girl and the dog, and how they had saved each other during their fight for survival. Emma received hundreds of cards and letters from people who had heard their story. More importantly, Emma's aunt came to the hospital as soon as she heard the news. She had been frantically searching for Emma ever since she disappeared from the shelter. With tears in her eyes, she told Emma that she wanted her to come live with her permanently, and that Max would be welcome too. "I should have come for you sooner," her aunt said, holding Emma's hand tightly. "I had no idea you were trying to reach me. I thought you were safe at the shelter." Emma explained how she had been too proud to ask for help and had decided to make the journey on her own. Her aunt promised that Emma would never have to face such difficulties alone again. She had already made arrangements to formally adopt Emma and give her the stable home she had always needed. As Emma recovered her strength over the next few days, she and Max became inseparable. The hospital staff made an exception to their usual rules and allowed Max to stay in Emma's room. He slept on a blanket beside her bed and seemed to understand that he needed to be gentle while she recovered. The rescue team visited Emma before she was discharged from the hospital. They presented Max with an honorary medal for his role in the rescue and told Emma that her survival story would be used to train future rescue teams. They said that the way she had cared for Max and how Max had ultimately saved her life was an inspiring example of loyalty and determination. On her last day in the hospital, Emma stood by the window with Max beside her, looking out at the snow-covered mountains where they had fought for their lives. She realized that while their ordeal had been terrifying and dangerous, it had also given her something precious, a true family that included both her aunt and the brave dog who had become her closest companion. Emma woke up before dawn on the fourth day with her mind made up. She had spent most of the night planning their escape from the cabin. The weather was clear, and she knew this might be their best chance to find help before their supplies ran out completely. Max sensed her determination and stayed close to her side as she prepared for their dangerous journey. She packed everything useful she could find into her small backpack. The remaining nuts and berries went into one pocket, and she filled her water bottle with melted snow. Emma also took some matches and a piece of the red fabric in case they needed to signal for help or start a fire. Every item had to be essential because she knew the difficult travel ahead would test both their strength and endurance. Before leaving, Emma wrote a note explaining who she was and what had happened. Just in case someone eventually found the cabin, she left it on the table where it would be easily seen. Looking around the small room that had saved their lives, she felt both grateful and sad to be leaving their temporary shelter. Max seemed to understand they were going on a long journey. His ears were alert and his body was tense with anticipation. Emma knelt down and looked into his intelligent brown eyes. "We're going to walk out of here together, boy. I don't know how far we'll have to go, but we're not giving up." The deep snow made walking incredibly difficult from the very beginning. Emma had to lift her legs high with each step, and she sank down past her knees with every movement forward. Max was better equipped for the conditions, but even he struggled in some of the deeper drifts. Within the first hour, Emma was already breathing heavily and sweating despite the cold temperature. They followed what Emma hoped was the same path she had used to reach the cabin. But everything looked different under the thick blanket of snow. The familiar landmarks were either buried or transformed beyond recognition. Emma tried to stay calm, but she realized they could easily get lost in the vast wilderness surrounding them. As the morning progressed, Emma began to feel the effects of several days with very little food. Her energy was draining quickly, and she had to stop frequently to rest. Max stayed close to her, sometimes walking ahead to test the depth of the snow, other times staying behind her as if to make sure she didn't fall. Around midday, they reached the top of a small hill that gave them a view of the surrounding area. Emma's heart sank when she saw nothing but endless white forest stretching in every direction. There were no signs of roads, buildings, or any other indication of human presence. She began to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake by leaving the cabin. Max suddenly started barking and running in circles around a particular spot in the snow. Emma hurried over to see what had excited him and discovered something that lifted her spirits: animal tracks leading down the hillside. The tracks looked like they had been made by deer, and Emma remembered reading that deer often followed the same paths to find water and shelter. "Good thinking, Max," she said, patting his head. "Animals know how to survive out here better than we do." If we follow these tracks, maybe they'll lead us to water or even to places where people might go hunting. The deer trail was easier to follow than trying to make their own path through the deep snow. The animals had packed down the snow somewhat, making it possible for Emma and Max to walk without sinking as deeply. Emma felt hope returning as they made steady progress down the hillside. But as the afternoon wore on, Emma's body began to rebel against the physical demands of their journey. She hadn't eaten a real meal in days, and the constant effort of walking through snow was exhausting her reserves of strength. Her legs felt like heavy weights, and she began stumbling more frequently. Max noticed her weakening condition and stayed even closer to her side. When Emma stumbled and fell into the snow for the third time in an hour, Max gently grabbed her jacket sleeve in his teeth and tried to help pull her back to her feet. The gesture was so touching that Emma felt tears freezing on her cheeks. As darkness began to fall, Emma knew they needed to find shelter for the night. They couldn't survive sleeping in the open without adequate protection from the cold. She looked around desperately for any kind of natural shelter, a cave, a dense grove of trees, or even a large rock formation that could block the wind. Max led her to a spot where several large pine trees had fallen against each other, creating a natural lean-to structure. Emma realized they could use this as the foundation for an emergency shelter. Working together, they gathered pine branches and packed snow around the sides to create walls that would block the wind. The shelter was cramped and far from comfortable, but it was better than being completely exposed to the elements. Emma shared their last few berries with Max, knowing it might be their final meal together. The reality of their situation was becoming impossible to ignore. They were lost in the wilderness with no food, and no one knew where to look for them. That night was the longest and coldest Emma had ever experienced. Despite huddling together under her thin blanket, both she and Max shivered constantly. Emma drifted in and out of exhausted sleep, always waking to check that Max was still breathing beside her. During one of these wake-up moments, Emma heard something that made her pulse quicken. It was a faint howling sound, but it wasn't the wind. Max's ears perked up immediately, and Emma realized they were hearing the calls of wild wolves somewhere in the darkness around them. The howling continued on and off throughout the night, sometimes sounding closer and sometimes farther away. Emma held Max tightly, knowing that wolves could be attracted to their scent and might see them as easy prey in their weakened condition. Max remained alert but calm, as if he understood the danger but wasn't afraid to face it. When dawn finally came, Emma was barely able to move. Her body was stiff from cold and hunger, and every muscle ached from the previous day's difficult journey. Max was in better condition, but she could see that he was also suffering from the effects of their ordeal. Emma knew they had to keep moving, or they would die in this makeshift shelter. Somehow she found the strength to stand up and pack their few belongings. As they prepared to continue their desperate search for help, Emma made a silent promise to herself and to Max. No matter what happened, she would not give up fighting for their survival. 6 months later, Emma stood in the backyard of her aunt's house throwing a tennis ball for Max to catch. The golden dog ran through the green grass with energy and joy, a completely different animal from the starving, frightened creature she had found in the snow. His fur was thick and shiny now, and his eyes sparkled with happiness and health. Emma's own transformation was just as remarkable. She had gained weight and grown taller, and the haunted look that had been in her eyes during her time on the streets was completely gone. Living with her Aunt Sarah had given her the stability and love she had always craved. She was doing well in her new school and had made several good friends who loved hearing stories about her and Max's adventure. The small town where they now lived had embraced both Emma and Max as local heroes. The newspaper had written several articles about their survival story, and Emma had been invited to speak at schools and community groups about perseverance and the importance of never giving up hope. Max always accompanied her to these events wearing his rescue medal proudly. Emma had also started volunteering at the local animal shelter on weekends. Her experience with Max had taught her how much abandoned animals needed love and care. She helped socialize dogs and cats that had been mistreated or neglected, using the patience and understanding she had developed during her own difficult times. One particular Saturday at the shelter, Emma was working with a scared young puppy when the shelter director approached her with some news. "Emma, I have something to tell you about Max's background," she said gently. "We finally heard back from the veterinarian in the next county. Emma looked up with concern, wondering if there was something wrong with Max's health that they hadn't discovered before. The director smiled and shook her head. It's good news, actually. Max wasn't just abandoned like we thought. He had been stolen from a family during a burglary 6 months before you found him. The thieves left him in the woods when they realized they couldn't sell him. Emma's heart ached thinking about Max's original family and how they must have grieved for their lost pet. Do they want him back? She asked quietly, even though the thought of losing Max made her feel sick. That's the amazing part, the director continued. When we contacted them, they said they had mourned Max and moved on. But when they heard about what he did to save your life, they said they couldn't think of anyone who deserved him more than you. They're grateful that he found someone who needed him as much as he needed them. Emma felt tears of relief and gratitude filling her eyes. Max seemed to sense the emotional conversation and came over to nuzzle against her leg. She knelt down and hugged him tightly, knowing that their bond had been officially blessed by the family who had loved him first. That evening, Emma and Max took their usual walk through the quiet streets of their neighborhood. Emma reflected on how much her life had changed since that terrifying day when she heard his whimpering in the snow. Finding Max had led her to discover strengths she never knew she had, and ultimately brought her to the loving home she had always dreamed of. As they walked, they passed the memorial bench that the town had installed in the park to honor their survival story. The plaque read, "In honor of Emma and Max, who proved that courage, loyalty, and hope can overcome any challenge." Emma sat on the bench for a moment with Max settling beside her, both of them watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Emma thought about all the people who had helped make their new life possible. Aunt Sarah, who had opened her heart and home, the rescue team who had never given up searching, the hospital staff who had cared for them, and the entire community that had welcomed them. She realized that while she and Max had saved each other in the wilderness, they had also been saved by the kindness of others. A year later, Emma received a letter that brought their story full circle. It was from a teenage boy named David who had read about her and Max in a magazine article. David was living in a group home and feeling hopeless about his future, much like Emma had felt before her ordeal in the mountains. "Your story gave me hope that things can get better," David wrote. "If you and Max could survive in the wilderness and find your way to happiness, maybe I can find my way too. Thank you for showing me that it's worth it to keep fighting." Emma immediately wrote back to David, encouraging him to never give up and offering to visit him if possible. She realized that sharing their story was helping other young people who were facing their own struggles and challenges. Max seemed to approve of this mission, always sitting patiently during her speaking engagements and seeming to understand the importance of their message as Emma folded David's letter and put it in her special box of correspondence from people their story had touched. Max jumped onto her bed and settled beside her. She looked into his intelligent brown eyes and saw the same trust and loyalty that had sustained them through their darkest hours. "We did okay, didn't we, boy?" she whispered, scratching behind his ears. "We saved each other, and now we get to help save others too." Max's tail thumped against the blanket in agreement, and Emma knew that their greatest adventure wasn't surviving in the wilderness. It was building a life filled with love, purpose, and the unbreakable bond between a girl and her dog who had refused to give up on each other or themselves. Outside their warm, safe home, snow began to fall gently, but this time it looked beautiful instead of threatening. Emma and Max had learned that they could face anything together, and that knowledge would stay with them for the rest of their lives.